leave a like and subscribe.
So hi, welcome back. In our last episode, we finished off that edition by talking about London and how people first arriving there back in the very early days had no work and no money, or at least not very much money, so they slowly gravitated to the East End parts of the city, which then very quickly became the rough and sump end of London, and we carry on from there. The only difference money could make was how often and how well they ate, whether they had warm clothes and footwear, or whether their kids lived or died. The same tenements that at one time housed 3 families would be let to any family who could find the rent money. Each room, not much bigger than twice the size of my current cell, would probably be home to mother, father, and anything up to 10 children at a rent of roughly 3 or 4 shillings a week, which could be more than half their income. For this, the tenant could expect a cold, damp room, crawling with well-established vermin and fleas. A toilet in the yard would serve all of the possible 100 tenants. If they were fortunate, they would have a single cold water tap on each floor. If not, all water for drinking and washing would have to be fetched from a standpipe in the yard. These water supplies would often be the cause of cholera outbreaks due to cesspits and overflowing drains contaminating the supply. While a good mother might do her best to keep the family's room clean, it's understandable that with enough problems on her plate, she wouldn't have the inclination to touch anything outside her own front door. So, it's not hard to imagine the state of the stairs leading up to the rooms, stinking from the caked mud and worse that puddled in the yard. With the authorities turning a blind eye to this no-go area of the East End, the cobbles must have been swimming in rotting garbage and sewage that leaked endlessly from broken and unrepaired drains. What had changed since medieval times? The smell wouldn't have been any different from those days when the better classes held a small posy of flowers under their noses to ward off the stench. It's in this indescribable place that my grandparents arrived to find work and raise their families. I like to think they were at the top end of that society, and knowing that our family has a trait for always fighting against adversity, I am sure they were. The fact that they raised families at all must mean something in a time when over half the children born in the East End never saw their 5th birthday. On my mother's side, my great-grandparents were a mixture of nationalities. My Nanny Lee's father was a heavily built, blue-eyed, fair-haired German. In later years, if mention of him was made in conversation, Nan would add in a conspiratorial whisper, "Not one of the bad ones, though." Her mother, fiercely Irish, was in appearance the opposite of her husband, dark-eyed, dark-haired and dark-complexioned, and her temper could match her looks too. An incident happened when Nan was a young girl that gave her mother a reputation for viciousness. Nan was cutting bread for a meal, and either daydreaming or hungry, she cut more than was necessary. Ignoring a cry that the bread had to last until the following day, she continued cutting. Her mother jumped up, grabbed the knife out of her hand, and stuck it in her daughter's wrist, shouting, "Now stop when I tell you." She bore a scar and a painful wrist for the rest of her life. Even in her 90s, she wore a band around it to ease the pain of arthritis. In fairness to my great-grandmother, perhaps it wasn't an evil temper that drove her to act in that way. She may have been like many mothers in those days, driven to near breaking point, worrying about where the next halfpenny was coming from. At that time, the Lee family lived just off Brick Lane. And one night, when she was about 10 years of age, Nan was woken up by the lamplighter's voice in the street outside calling, "Don't go out, the Ripper's been about." She told me that she pulled the blankets over her head, cowering in fear. The following day, they discovered that one of Jack the Ripper's victims, Annie Chapman, had been found under the arches in Hanbury Street, just around the corner from where they lived. Nanny Lee could remember a time when she was even younger of passing a shop opposite the London hospital where the Elephant Man was on display at an entrance fee of 2p. It was out of the question that her mother would waste so much money on frivolity, so she never did see him. In later years she would look at the exploitation of unfortunate people as wrong, but she would say that in those days it was all quite normal. about Grandad Lee's mother apart from her name, which was Helen Weppington, and she was known to her grandchildren as Nanny Wep. His father was a gypsy cattle drover and had a name I've never heard anywhere else, Crotcher, which may have been a nickname, but he was never known as anything else. Originally, he could have settled in any part of the country, but because of his work, bringing cattle and sheep into London, he would regularly have found himself on the main drove into the city, which was Whitechapel Road. That is why it is one of the widest roads to be found in the city. Part of his job would have been to slaughter the cattle or sheep he had driven, so when tiring of the hardships of the road, where else would he have looked to find settled work than the abattoirs of the East End? For a man with ambition, natural progression from the slaughterhouse would have been to become a butcher himself, and this he did, eventually setting up the first butcher's shop in Smithfield Market. Being out of sight or sound of the market for so long, I cannot be sure that it is still in place, but on a wall in the market there used to be a plaque bearing the words Lee and Cody, commemorating the fact that they were founders of the market. Who Cody was, I've no idea, as I never heard that Crutcher Lee had a partner. Unfortunately, for a man who had pulled himself up from nothing, he was to end the last 17 years of his life confined to a mental hospital or an epilepsy institution, which was probably one and the same thing at the time. No one knew what brought on his epilepsy, but there was an occasion when he had an accident while driving one of his double horse carts. It was a winter's night, and it had been raining. As it got dark, the weather turned icy. Standing up to draw the horses to rein, he slipped on the iced-over footboard and fell between the shafts, receiving a serious head injury. Not long after this, he had his first epileptic fit. These were to plague him for many years, with sometimes as many as 3 or 4 a day. The family became used to them and were not too concerned, and nor was he, as long as there was a cup of strong sweet tea and a tot of rum ready by his elbow as the seizure passed. That is, until the night he had what they used to call a brainstorm. Clutching a long, flaying knife, he tried to kill his wife and kids as though they were animals in his slaughterhouse. Thank God no one was hurt, but he was taken away to a colony at Hanbury, where he would spend the rest of his life. His fearsome actions earned him a bit of a reputation, which even extended to his family. My old Uncle Joe, Crutcher's grandson, told me he was taken to see him when he was a small boy. In his pleasure at seeing the boy he was so fond of, Crutcher kept picking him up and throwing him towards the ceiling. Joe said, "In later years I could look back and feel sorry for the old boy, because he never done me any harm, but at the time I was terrified, so I told my dad I didn't want to go back, and I never saw him again." As I was brought up mainly among the extended family of the Lees, I soaked up their history and family stories from the moment I was old enough to understand. Every one of them loved to talk, and I was always ready to listen. But as with families, there is always a leaning towards one side or the other. Involvement with the maternal or paternal side is rarely down the middle in equal shares. For this reason, my memories and knowledge of the Kray side are scant. We learned very little from my father, for though my father's biggest asset as a wardrobe dealer or buyer and seller of second-hand clothing was the gift of the gab, at home he wasn't a great one for conversation, at least not on the kind of subject the Lees loved so much, talking of the past. As much as I do know of the Krays is that they were gypsies, not tinkers or diddycoyer, but true Romanes. The Kray surname suggests they came from those families who travelled through Romania, Hungary and Austria. Why they should have left Central Europe and travelled across the sea to Britain is not known, but as wandering was in their blood, it is not surprising that they should gravitate towards what was then the richest capital in the world. That they ended up in the poorest part imaginable could have been due to circumstance, but more likely that as horse dealers, the position in the centre of town was perfect for supplying the animals, which were as depended upon then as the car and lorry are today. The world of the 1870s into which my grandparents were born was one of exciting change, new inventions and great happenings, but none of this would have any effect on the people who struggled for existence inside this ghetto, shunned by those outside it, but the slum-like conditions and hardships of the area were no worse and possibly better than what the Krays had been used to. Because of their background, my grandfathers Jimmy Kray and John Lee were similar characters, both short, strong, streetwise and very tough, both survivors. As kids they would have helped the family income with a bit of thieving. Nothing serious, but it was part of life then, as it always had been, and would be right up until and beyond my own childhood. A lump of coal off the back of a passing cart, a bit of fruit from under one of the stalls in Brick Lane or Hoxton Market, and, if they were quick on their feet, a loaf of bread out of the window of the baker's. Most of the shops then would hang their wares outside to catch the customer's eye, all securely tied with a bit of string. But what boy didn't carry a knife? A quick slash and there was a teapot, a brush or a pair of shoes to keep or sell to neighbours. On top of that, there would be the legitimate work of helping their fathers, or there would be work to be had like minding or leading horses for tradesmen, pulling handcarts, or running errands for anyone who cared to hire their services. When free to pursue their own enterprise, young boys would perhaps collect discarded boxes from the markets, break them into firewood, and sell the bundles at ½ each. Anything for a few coppers to put food on the table. All these things when they were less than 10 years old. Real childhood in those days probably didn't extend much beyond the age of 5. Without such entertainment as the cinema or television, children's heroes would be those of flesh and blood, local hard men and villains who could be looked up to, and of course boxers, for fighting was in the blood of every man and boy in the East End. How else could you prove yourself as a real man? How else could any of them dream of escaping from the hardship and grinding poverty? Could they become a famous writer like Charles Dickens or an actor like Henry Irving? No, because this was about as likely as flying, but with their fists, it was possible to become rich and famous. "60 or more years later, my brother Ron and I would have the same dream of fame. It's a reasonable guess to suppose my grandfathers would have followed the careers of heroes such as John L. Sullivan, Jim Corbett and Bob Fitzsimmons, perhaps cutting out pen drawings illustrating their fights from the penny papers. Neither Jimmy nor John ever reached fame and riches with the gloves on, but both were known throughout the East End as ferocious fighters. Dad's father earned the title Mad Jimmy Kray because he was all of that. Mad to take on men twice his size that he soon cut down. Mad to take the punishment he did without backing off, and when facing an opponent completely and madly fighting until he'd savagely beaten them. Grandad Lee was more boxer than fighter, and he took the gloves up professionally for some time as a flyweight. Not that he was fussy about staying within this category. At 9 stone 4, he would take on anyone for a fiver, didn't matter how big they were. He earned his name and reputation on the strength of his right-hand punch, which his opponents, after they had been picked up off the canvas, swore they never saw coming. The name Southpaw Cannonball Lee might not be in the reference books, but it's still remembered in the minds of those who saw him in action. If that makes you think that anyone who can have memories of that famous punch must be very old indeed, think again. He was still using it when he was 75 and more than willing to use it at 95. It's a strange thing that even something like a style of boxing can be passed on to another generation, not by teaching but through the chemistry of the body. I am told that when I was in the ring I took after Grandad Lee, and I'm sure Ron would not disagree that his technique of steaming in and flattening the opposition came straight from the genes of Grandad Kray. By the time my grandparents had married and were raising families, the facts about their lives become clearer. I can imagine Jimmy Lee was a pleased and proud man when Mary presented him with a son. A man's firstborn is special, particularly if it's a boy, for this child would carry the name forward. They would play together, then work together, and with coaching from his old man, this lad would realize aspirations that the father hadn't reached. Perhaps by taking the boxing world by storm, Cannonball Lee Jr., world champion. The the dream was to be short-lived, for cradled in his father's arms, little Jimmy went into a convulsion and died. Nan and Grandad had a close relationship and thought the world of each other, but they shared a sense of humour that might have appeared cruel to anyone who didn't know them. Years later, Nan would point at Grandad and say with apparent seriousness, "It was looking at his face that killed that poor baby." Around 1900, Joe was born. Money must have been hard to come by because he remembers they were constantly on the move from one room to another. More than once, Grandad would give a landlord a good hiding when he got fed up with constant demands for the rent. One time they ended up on the streets without even the money for a night's lodgings. Taking pity on his daughter's plight, her father allowed Mary and Joe to move in with him, but no way was the old man welcome. Jimmy's language and aggressive ways were not acceptable, so while Jimmy bedded down among the horses he worked with, Joe and his mother lived in unaccustomed comfort for a short while. One afternoon, as they all sat round the tea table, a neighbour called in and was invited to join them. For a long time, young Joe stared with fascination at the man's wispy beard until, unable to contain himself any longer, he patted his mother on the arm to get her attention and said loudly, "Mum, that man looks like a fucking billy goat." Shocked beyond belief, Mary's father said, "Mary, I suggest you pack your bags and take that child out of this house." They were back on the streets again. Their financial position must have improved by the time they decided to have a photographic portrait taken of their son Joe. In those days, you would go into a shop and be very formally snapped against a background scene of mountains or a waterfall. They would also supply props to give the picture that extra something. In Joe's case, this was a large cup and saucer hat. He kicked up hell and refused to wear it. When the threat of a clip around the ear didn't work, Mary tried bribery. "Wear the hat for the nice man and I'll buy you something on the way home." That did it. He couldn't get it on his head quickly enough. On their way home, Joe chose a toy whip from a stall in Whitechapel Road, and for a while was content to drive imaginary cattle in front of the two of them. However, as they turned into Brick Lane, they came across a donkey and cart laden with tinware, buckets, pots and pans and various other bits and bobs. The driver was in the shop unloading, and to young Joe, the donkey's rear end was just too tempting to ignore. In a flash, he gave the poor unsuspecting animal a stinging crack across the arse. It shrieked in pain and surprise and took off down the lane as though its tail was on fire. Shamed, his mother dragged him down a side turning before the carter spotted them. This from a man who today, aged 95, still strong and in good health, would have all children exterminated as being cheeky, unruly, and beyond the control of their parents. Gradually the family grew. Joe was followed 13 years later by John, and then in quick succession May, Rose, and my mother Violet. Sitting here now thinking of how Nanny Lee described her as a child conjures up a lovely mental picture, small and plump with bright rosy cheeks, a happy little girl whom the rest of the family called Doodle. Bit of a dreamer though. If she was sent down the road to buy 2 pennyworth of pickled herring, she would eat the fish on the way home, then, with genuine innocence, carefully put the bones on the table, or she'd be sent down to the shop to fetch a bowl of faggots and peas pudding, and then slowly walk home with the bowl on her head pretending it was a hat. One day her mother spotted her from the door and shouted out, "Don't you dare drop that basin." She did. Rose, though, was a live wire, as she would be all her life. She never stood still, always had to be tearing about. One day, scuffing down the road with one foot on the back plate of a little pushchair, she ran into the legs of a neighbour 4 or 5 doors away. There was a bit of a row, and whether the woman raised a hand to her I don't know, but just at that moment, Grandad Lee came along. Jimmy wouldn't hit a woman, but as the woman's husband had come out of the house to join in the argument, he was soon knocked sprawling on the pavement by that famous left hook. From the door behind him, a bull-sized neighbour stepped out, put 2 punches into Jimmy's back and went back inside. Little Rose stood there, not a bit frightened. She'd seen her dad in action too many times for it to upset her. Roaring his head off, Jimmy kicked the door open and, in his own words, paid him dreadful. Jimmy seemed to spend his days teaching someone or other a lesson. When he worked as a pair-horse carman for a firm called Donaldson's, he was offloading chests of tea down at Hayes Wharf when one of the horses, bored with standing idle, took a nip at a passing docker. The man picked up a length of wood and belted the horse straight between the eyes. Grandad shouted at him, "Oh, aye, you bastard! Pack it in before I give you the same." Dockers were notorious for their toughness, and without hesitation, he shouted back, "Okay, shorty, fucking come here and try it," at the same time grabbing Grandad by the leg and pulling him off the tailgate. Knocked spark out. He was carried into a little factory opposite by some of the women workers. He probably thought he was in heaven when he woke up, as he had an eye for the ladies. Uncle Joe told me that when he came home that night, his dad's broken face was horrible to look at, but he shrugged off everyone's concern and said, "It's nothing to what his face is going to look like when I finish with him next time." The next day he went looking for the man, found him and battered him senseless. But that wasn't enough. Every time he saw the man after that, he attacked him. 9 fights later, the docker gave up his job and disappeared. That was Grandad Lee. He could carry a grudge forever. When Grandad went after a couple of tiny upstairs rooms in Emming Street in Bethnal Green, he told the landlady who lived downstairs that there was only him, his wife, and a boy. Later that day, when 7 of them moved in, she kicked up hell. "This ain't on," she angrily said. "You wait till my old man comes home." When the poor bloke came home from work and was sent upstairs to clear out all these lodgers, he got a good hiding and was flung down the stairs. It must have got smoothed over because they lived there for ages afterwards and got on well with the owners. Not that it was all plain sailing. One afternoon, Nan came back from shopping with the 3 girls, put a match to the oven and blew the place up. Somehow the gas taps had been left on. It's a miracle none of them were killed. As it was, the cooker was wrecked, glass blown out of the window, and little May got a cut head. Life wasn't all bad though. Because of his boxing, Jimmy was a keep-fit fanatic, and he would think nothing of cycling to Southend, having a run along the front, then pedalling his heavy, straight-framed Raleigh all the way home. When he could, he'd rope in young Joe and John for the ride, but they were less keen, and if they saw him tucking his trousers into his socks, they'd make themselves scarce double quick. One day he saw a mate of his pulling a street barrow, and he was making hard work of it, puffing and panting. "What's up with you?" Jimmy says to him. "I could pull that fucking thing to Southend without breaking into a sweat." Quick as a flash, his mate said, "Bet you a pound you couldn't." In those days, you could rent a cart for a couple of shillings a day. So next morning, Jimmy got up early, hired a cart without saying what he wanted it for, and set off 40 miles to the coast. He won his bet and picked up his pound, but a week later he bumped into the cart hire man who said, "Hoi Jim, you owe me 15 bob for the cart." "No, I don't," said Grandad. "I only used it for one day, and anyway it had a wonky wheel, so I left it." "Left it where?" screamed the bloke. "Southend. Here's your 2 bob. Now piss off." Knowing Grandad's reputation, the man swallowed it, but he never let him hire another cart.
Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed the video, please join our Facebook group. It's called Krays Crime Lords of London. We're a friendly moderated group with over 1,000 Kray and other celebrated gangster videos available for view. There's also thousands of images in the photos sections. The link for the group is in the YouTube description section. I hope we see you there soon.
Leave a like and subscribe.